Demon's Souls is a bizarre game in just about every way that a game can be, starting right at the premise itself. It's clearly inspired by medieval fantasy stories, but with none of the pageantry or fanciful fun that such stories usually have. Even actual medieval history has more comic relief in it than this game. Demon's Souls is an excessively tragic and bleak experience. Imagine a Kurosawa film like Throne of Blood or something, only darker and with fewer relatable characters. The gameplay goes out of its way to reinforce the game's dark tone as well. Souls games are renowned for their uncompromising, sometimes brutal mechanics, and Demon's Souls is no slouch in this department. This is the game that, if you fail at any particular section several times in a row, will essentially say, "Oh, are you having trouble with this level? Those skeletons giving you a hard time? Well, here's half a dozen secret bonus enemies that are even harder, you pathetic weakling." Yet oddly, this is the only Souls game I've ever really been able to get into. Maybe it's just that I'm old-fashioned, but everything about Demon's Souls, even the gameplay, clicked with me in a way that its spiritual successors never did. I've actually beaten this game, which may not seem like such a big deal until I tell you that I've never even made it past the Undead Burg in Dark Souls. And as for Dark Souls 2, actually my therapist said I shouldn't talk about Dark Souls 2, at least not until he can get new Windows installed in his office. Anyway, I was recently thinking about what it is in Demon's Souls that made me really want to push through to the end. It's not a particularly approachable game. In fact, it's even less so than later games in the Souls series. The story has a few intriguing elements, but it's really not all that interesting overall. Half of the characters are just kind of bland, and the rest spend most of their time stabbing you in the back, or stabbing other NPCs in the back, or stabbing themselves in the stomach. They're not terribly friendly, is what I'm getting at. So I'm left with only one idea for what must have hooked me about this game. The setting. Demon's Souls has a dedication to visual realism that impressed me from the very beginning. The color palette is often quite drab, and buildings look dilapidated and dirty, but I'd never describe the game's visual style as boring. It's more like the beat-up look of the spaceships in the original Star Wars. These are stylistic touches that make the world feel lived in, and as a result, more believable. But the down-to-earth realism goes deeper than the visuals, right down to the level design. In Demon's Souls, a jail feels like a real jail because of its architecture, which forces you through a maze of narrow corridors lined with dozens upon dozens of cells, some of which have interesting things inside and some of which don't. The Boletarian Palace isn't a fantasy castle with plush carpets and paintings hanging on the walls. It's a fortress, an enormous heap of bare stone designed to withstand a siege, with gates and portcullises at every turn to keep out invaders, like, for instance, you. Most of the bridges, shortcuts, and other level elements in Demon's Souls come across as purely practical and functional, as if ordinary people actually have to live and work in the places you're slicing your way through. And because of this realism, while I was playing, I couldn't shake a feeling very similar to the one I got from playing Shadow of the Colossus, that this fictional country of Boletaria was actually based on some real place that I'd seen before. Obviously, all fantasy worlds are based loosely on real places. Art is based on what we already know, and it would be hard to believe that Hidetaka Miyazaki and his team had never seen a castle before, or that they didn't know what a swamp looked like in real life. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm saying is that the 5 levels in Demon's Souls seem to fit together somehow, that you could find a country, or at least a region in the real world, containing all the environments seen in the game, as diverse and unique as they are. I think that Boletaria is more real than anybody, or at least anybody outside of FromSoft, expected, and today I'm going to tell you why. Right off the bat, this is going to be more difficult than when I tried to place the Forbidden Lands from Shadow of the Colossus. Most of the Forbidden Lands looks pretty similar. I'd say the biggest difference is between the dense forests in the south and the barren desert to the north. But this combination actually isn't so uncommon in the real world, and the environment as a whole blends together, if not seamlessly, then at least believably. Boletaria, on the other hand, is disconnected, both literally and visually. You don't travel between its 5 levels, you warp to them, and this allowed the designers to make them strikingly different from each other without straining credulity. The Boletarian Palace is the least complicated, not surprising since it's the first one you visit. This castle could really be in any mountainous country on Earth, although the general look of the place, especially the armor and weapons used by the enemies, strongly suggests medieval Europe. The introductory cinematic does, however, describe Boletaria as a northern kingdom, which suggests a parallel with the north of Europe. Stonefeng Tunnel conveys a very similar impression. Mountains, medieval technology, vaguely European. One important thing to note, though, is the lava in the second and third stages. This is important because it means that Stonefang is technically a volcano, something you don't see everywhere. Then we have the Tower of Latria. I would argue that this is the part of the game that leans most heavily on fantasy tropes instead of real history for its design. The focus on magic and illusion is one reason for this, but there's also the surreal, unsettling architecture of the level's second half. These towers that you walk between, poised unsteadily on top of spindly little pillars rising hundreds of feet above a luminously purple swamp, feel completely impossible, which might be one reason among many why this level is so damn scary to play through. But if Latria is the strongest argument against my theory that Boletaria is based on a real place, the next level, the Shrine of Storms, is probably my best argument for it. The Shrine of Storms is explicitly set on an island that was once home to a race of druid-like pagans known as the Shadow Men. None of the other places I've mentioned can be placed with any confidence on our label-less map of Boletaria, but because we know that this is an island, we get a rough idea of where it must be. It's one of these bits in the southeast. Finally, we have the Valley of Defilement, better known to most players as just the Swamp. It's a filthy bog overrun with vermin and disease. In fact, apart from a handful of traps in other levels, this is the only place in the game where you can be afflicted with poison. Or in the last stage, even better, the plague. As far as geographical markers go, the fact that it's constantly raining here is noteworthy, as is the topography of the land. The first stage is set in a series of wooden shanty huts built into steep hills, while the second is leveled off and sort of bowl-shaped. If you pay attention to how the level design routes you around, you'll notice it generally forces you to move in a wide circle while slowly descending. In other words, it's a downward spiral, much like Dante's legendary descent into hell. I mean, that's not the only thing that makes this level feel like a visit to hell, but it certainly helps. So that's what we've got. A mountain castle, a volcanic mine, a city built on a swamp, a rocky island, and a swamp. And even though some of these places, notably Latria, are described as being in different countries than Boletaria, it's reasonable to suppose that none of these places is more than 100 or so miles away from the others. The first question that occurs is, could Boletaria be anywhere other than Europe? On the face of it, this seems unlikely. Everything about the people who inhabit this world, their technology, their culture, their religion, it all just screams Europe. And if we do assume that this is in Europe, it narrows our search considerably. Why? Because of the Shrine of Storms. Almost all of Eastern Europe is either landlocked or faces the Black Sea, which has no prominent islands in it. Since none of these countries could possibly be near the Shrine of Storms, we can eliminate all of them right away. Also, take another look at that map for a second. While it doesn't give us many details, two very clear ones are that the country is part of a much larger continent that stretches out to the west, and that the Shrine of Storms is almost certainly southeast of mainland Boletaria. This means our country couldn't possibly be Italy, Greece, or France. Spain is barely possible, and in fact the existence of two countries on the Iberian Peninsula is suggestive of Boletaria and Latria. But the culture just seems wrong here. There's actually a much better candidate a little farther to the north. Great Britain was a candidate that stood out to me right away when I started thinking about a real-world analog for Boletaria. It's got mountains in the north, where the palace and Stonefeng Tunnel could be, lots of rocky islands, such as the Isle of Man, which have ancient pagan traditions and lots of stormy weather, and of course if you want to visit a dreary, disease-ridden swamp where it rains all the time, Wales is full of them. This is a country with a long history of fantasy stories, a diverse landscape that could include any one of the 5 levels from Demon's Souls, and a classic medieval European culture that fits the game's story. People's voices match up as well. The blacksmiths you talk to have Scottish accents and are from Stonefang, which is a lot like Scotland. Most other characters have English accents of various types, from Cockney to received pronunciation. Also, Hidetaka Miyazaki has mentioned in interviews that much of his inspiration for the Souls games came from Western fantasy novels that he had trouble understanding because his English wasn't great, meaning he was reading English and American fantasy novels, which are mostly set in worlds based on English history and mythology. At first this seemed like a slam dunk. Boletaria's Britain, end of story. But then I started to have doubts. After all, the fact that characters in the game have British accents could easily just be because I'm playing a game aimed at an English-speaking audience, and British accents are a pretty cheap way of establishing a fantasy setting. But there is also a far more serious problem that rules Britain out entirely: Stonefang Tunnel. Remember how I mentioned that the later stages of Stonefang are set in an active volcano? Well, Great Britain doesn't have any of those. At all. The last known volcanic activity in the British Isles happened tens of millions of years ago, long before the age of recorded history. There's no place in the entire United Kingdom that looks anything like what shows up in the lower parts of Stonefang. This is a bigger deal than it might initially seem. I mean, nothing like the second stage of Latria exists in reality either, but that's architecture, it's not the setting itself. The lava in Stonefang isn't magical or impossible. Places that look like this do exist in the real world, just not anywhere close to where I thought Boletaria was. But all wasn't lost. There was another possibility. In fact, one very close to Great Britain. Scandinavia. If Boletaria was Sweden, everything would still line up. The look of the map, the islands to the southeast, the mountains. The characters could fit in too, assuming that their accents are just indications of status instead of literally how the people are speaking. Some characters, like Sage Frake, really do seem like they're from that part of the world anyway, and Western fantasy, including Tolkien, is as much Scandinavian as it is English. Best of all, there is an active volcano in Norway called Bjærenberg. It actually erupted as recently as 1980. There's only one problem: the location. Maybe you can already tell from this picture what the problem is. It's right up in front if you haven't figured it out yet. Water. Stonefang is clearly nowhere near the ocean. As soon as you enter it, you can get a good view of the surrounding countryside, and what you see is mountains in every direction. There is what appears to be a river running through a valley, but that's it. Bjærenberg is about as far from this as you can get. It's on an island. It practically is the island. Not only that, but the volcano has a permanent coating of ice on top of it, which means it doesn't even look like Stonefang. Once again, the volcano is the deal-breaker. If I wasn't going to give up at this point and admit that Boletaria is just a made-up fantasy land, I would have to get pretty creative. So I did. All this time I had been assuming that Boletaria was somewhere in Western Europe. I got so wrapped up in the culture of Boletaria and its parallels to fantasy fiction that I overlooked some fairly basic geographical facts. Like beginning of the game basic. Vague as this map is, it does give us one extremely important clue. The ocean is to the east of the continent. Why did I rule out Eastern Europe earlier when this map, the lone piece of cartographic data we have about Boletaria, actually rules out everything but the eastern coast of Europe? But wait, you say, Europe doesn't have an eastern coast. What you're looking at is Asia. Oh, that's absolutely correct. Which is why Boletaria must be in the only country that stretches all the way from Europe to the edge of Asia. Russia. Russia is the single largest country in the world, and also one of the most geographically and culturally diverse. It's a place that contains, among other things, the largest swamp in the northern hemisphere, a landlocked volcano that still oozes lava today, and a series of rocky, rain-drenched islands along its eastern coast. Even the twisted towers of Latria wouldn't look so strange alongside the surreal nightmare that is St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. The idea that the different levels of demon souls are far apart from each other geographically, but all part of the same empire, actually makes a lot more sense than assuming that such widely varying environments would exist right on top of each other. And Russia has historically served as a kind of cultural bridge between Europe and Asia, which partially resolves the apparent inconsistencies of a Western fantasy game with obvious Eastern influences. This theory explains, for instance, why you find Japanese katanas lying around on the Shrine of Storms. The Kuril Islands off Russia's eastern coast are so close to Japan that Japan actually claims they belong to it. These islands were also home to what both the Japanese and the Russians saw as a strange race of people who practiced a curious animistic religion, the Ainu, who could easily be a stand-in for demon souls' shadow men. The parts of the world that seemed so strange and jarring when I thought of Boletaria as an analog for England suddenly just work when you assume it's Russia instead. Even the bleak, fatalistic quality of Russian culture seems to mesh with demon souls' depressing tone and atmosphere. Greed consuming a man's soul, a country being betrayed into the hands of inhuman monsters, the slow but steady degeneration of science, religion, and common decency. This is the kind of stuff you'd find in a thick-as-a-doorstop 19th century Russian novel like, well, not to hit the nail on the head too hard, Demons by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So am I saying that Hidetaka Miyazaki definitely intended for Boletaria to be a fantasy version of Russia? That he was just sitting around in the dank Gothic castle that I assume he lives in, reading a Dostoevsky novel and gulping down black coffee by the gallon, and then finally he sprang up and said, "I have an idea for a video game"? Obviously no. It's far more likely that he was just doing what most writers do, combining his own life experience with stuff he learned from fiction. It's the same reason that people in the Western fantasy kingdom of Hyrule sometimes wear rice hats and kimonos. I have no idea what Miyazaki actually knows about medieval Europe. He seems reasonably knowledgeable about it, but that doesn't mean he's an expert on history or geography. He might not even know what Kamchatka is. At the end of the day, Demon Souls is absolutely a pastiche that mixes different regional tropes together. Russia may work as a setting for Demon's Souls levels, but that doesn't explain this clearly non-Russian armor, or all the names that obviously aren't Russian, or the fact that no one in the game has a Russian accent. And yes, in case you were wondering, because I was, even in the Japanese version of Demon's Souls, characters still speak English with various regional accents. The only difference is in the subtitles, which demonstrates quite clearly that these accents were a deliberate part of the original story. But the fact that I could even have this impression at all about Demon's Souls, this feeling that Boletaria is a real place, to me underscores how different a game it is from its successors. Most of FromSoft's games have settings based on one major influence. Yharnam from Bloodborne is English and based on Lovecraftian horror. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is clearly set in Japan. Dranglake from Dark Souls 2 is obviously Scandinavian. Even Dark Souls, creative as it is, doesn't feel real to me because so much of the world of Lordran is over-the-top fantastical. Demon's Souls is different. It has a kind of grittiness and realism to it that I don't see in either its sequels, or, unfortunately, the recent remake of it for the PS5. I love Bluepoint Games. Their remake of Shadow of Colossus was brilliant. But to me, the real Demon's Souls will always be the original, warts and all. So what do you think? Does Boletaria feel as real to you as it does to me? Do you think it belongs where I put it on the map, or am I light years away from getting it right? If you have a better theory than mine, I'd love for you to leave me a comment and explain it. And whatever you do, may the heavens smile benevolently upon you. Umbasa.